Hello, my name is Andy Gillies, and this is a speech for simultaneous interpreting practice from English. And the topic of the speech will be changing military doctrine and changing defence industry as a result of the war in Ukraine. And I'll start now. Every now and again, technology changes in such a fundamental way that it actually changes the way that war operates, the way that warring parties fight one another. What do I mean? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. In the 16th century, the musket, so guns, were introduced into warfare, and it completely changed the way the armies organised themselves. It changed the tactics and the strategies of warfare. Fast forward a few hundred years to the First World War, and we have the introduction of machine guns and artillery, rapid fire artillery. That too completely changed the way that countries went to war. And the Second World War looked very different to the First World War as a result. A further example would be the Gulf War in 1991, where more or less for the first time the military relied on accuracy over volume was the doctrine. That means very sophisticated weaponry was used for very precise strikes at enemy targets, but not a large volume of troops or a large volume of equipment. And now what I'd like to suggest today is that the war in Ukraine is actually going to have the same effect. It's going to be what the experts call a revolution in military affairs, where technology changes lead to changes in the way military operations are actually carried out. And I'm going to follow that on by saying that it's also having an effect on industrial supply chains and the defence industry that is obviously behind any army involved in a war. So let's begin with some of the military doctrines that have been in place that I think are going to have to change. The first one is air superiority. For as long as I can remember, military forces have tried to gain air superiority first so that they would have the freedom to move their troops across land without risking attack from the air. That was the case in the Gulf in 1991, in Serbia, in Iraq in 2003, and Afghanistan as well. But the underlying principle on which that doctrine is based is that airspace is a single space, a unitary space. And I think that what we've seen in Ukraine is that that's no longer the case. There are actually a number of different levels of airspace. So aircraft traditionally operate at altitude, 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet. But in Ukraine, we have a lot of drones, quadcopters, small, simple devices that are operating at very, very low altitudes, 50, 100, 150 feet. And having domination of an airspace at the level airplanes fly is not offering domination at this lower level where drones fly. Equally, the size difference and the size difference is so great that airplanes can't usefully attack quadcopter drones. So Russia can have superiority at one level of airspace, but doesn't have it across all the different levels of airspace. And that impacts on then military operations. Because, for example, whilst Russia may control the high altitude military airspace, and they don't have control over a large number of low altitude surveillance drones that Ukraine is using. And so the Russians can't mass large numbers of troops in any one place without them being seen, because that takes time. And so the drones will see them, and then the Ukrainian side can react. The second doctrine that I think is coming apart at the seams in Ukraine is the one I mentioned from the Gulf War in 1991, which is accuracy over volume. In the Gulf War, we had very expensive, very precise, long-distance munitions, replacing the need for a large number of ground troops or a large amount of equipment. But what we've seen in Ukraine is that accuracy is now available at a very low cost. Drones are able to go not just 1 or 2 kilometers, but hundreds of kilometers and attack targets for very little cost. And this is very important because if they don't cost very much, you can have volume and accuracy at the same time. You no longer have to have this trade-off. The other sort of dichotomy relates to defense and attack. If you have a large number of cheap drones attacking your country, but your defensive mechanisms are very expensive but accurate, you probably run out of them before you've knocked out all of the drones. And I think we saw an indication of where things are going with this, with the Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace. Those drones were shot down, but they were shot down by jet planes that were scrambled to do so. So the cost of shooting down a drone that may have cost a few hundred or a few $1,000 was millions of dollars. And that's not a sustainable cost ratio in a long-lasting war. The third doctrine is very much related to that, and it's the idea that having the best technology will win you the war, or at least is an advantage. It's not so much the best technology that is gaining advantage in Ukraine, but rather the best integration, the best networking of technologies, which are not necessarily the best available. What do I mean by that? Well, Ukraine uses a platform, a software called Delta, which layers data from different sources in order to identify targets. So, for example, if you had a radio antenna that told you a particular area was quite heavy in radio traffic, you wouldn't necessarily know what to make of that bit of information coming from a single source. But the Delta platform allows the Ukrainians to layer that with, let's say, satellite photography and CCTV cameras. And then suddenly what they can see on their screens is that a group of buildings has a lot of radio traffic, and that CCTV shows a lot of people going into one of the buildings but not another. Now that might mean that it's a command center and that it's a good target to attack. So the layering of data makes it possible to identify targets much more successfully, and that's what Ukrainians have been doing. This idea has actually caught on in the West to some extent already, and the sometimes controversial company Palantir is doing similar things. The big advantage in military terms to this sort of data-driven approach is that you have a lower cost to kill ratio. Now that's a fairly brutal sounding term, but the cost is lower for each enemy soldier killed in two different ways. It's lower in monetary terms, and it's also lower in the number of your own soldiers that are killed. And those two things are crucial in modern warfare. I think at this point it might be useful just to digress for a moment and address three misconceptions that I see surrounding the idea of drone warfare. The first of those is that drones are very small and short range, and that by using drones you can give up using other weapons. That's not really the case at all. Drones now can operate at short range, medium range, or even up to 800 kilometers. But they're used together with or to complement other types of weapon, or indeed to make them more efficient. So the drones are running reconnaissance, which means that your artillery is more accurate, for example. So the use of drones is really about balancing out capabilities on the battlefield. The side using the drones can make up for having less heavy equipment by using their heavy equipment more efficiently. The other misconception is that drones, as they stand at the moment, represent some sort of end point to a process. No, they're just a stage. In the same way that the musket was not an end point, and guns have continued to develop over the years, the drone as we know it now is not an end point. They will continue to develop and develop and develop. And then the third misconception that I would like to refute is that these drones represent some sort of poor man's version of air power, some sort of emergency solution. They may have emerged from Ukraine's lack of heavy equipment, lack of air force, or what have you, but they are now an integral part of modern warfare. And regardless of how much resources a country has available to its military, they're going to need to get a handle on drone warfare. So drones may have emerged out of some of the constraints that the Ukrainian military had imposed upon it, but they've turned out to be very effective, and when networked, extremely efficient. They're quick to develop and they're cheap. So let me come back to my original premise. I said I wanted to talk about military doctrines changing, and I've done that. Now I want to say something about how this war is affecting the way the defence industry is organised. So, in the past, military production and military spending has been very much state-run, state-controlled, centralised. Equipment has been very, very expensive and very slow to develop. Just think about fighter jets, for example. Billions and billions of euro with development over 20 or 30 years. But in Ukraine, what we're seeing are people on the front line modifying the technology on a day-to-day basis as a direct result of the battlefield experience that they have. They're seeing what's happening and they're reacting, and they're tweaking the drones and then sharing that information with other parts of the Ukrainian armed forces. So the research and development is going on the front line, not in some distant back office full of engineers, but rather in the trenches with the soldiers. And I give you a very good example of this. Drones are being used, remotely controlled drones, and very quickly both sides started jamming the signal so that the controller could no longer control the drones. What then happened was that, in fact, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, developed a type of drone that was actually still attached to the remote controller by a very thin, very light fibre-optic cable. So these drones are literally dragging a cable behind them, but it's so light it doesn't affect its flight. Now those cables, they can't be jammed, they can be cut, but they're crossing front lines, so there aren't people out there able to cut them. And that means that these drones can be reliably controlled from many, many kilometers away. These cables can be very, very long. They're so light. So that was a direct result of seeing that signals being jammed and needing a solution to that. The way that industry is changing relates directly to the way that the EU is helping Ukraine. So traditionally, the EU might just have sent weapons or sent money to Ukraine. But there are two other models that I'd briefly like to look at, one of which I think is particularly interesting. So the German model, which is a little bit different to this, let's say, aid model, is where German companies are building for Ukraine in Germany, and Germany is paying for that. Now that's very good for Ukraine. It gets weapons it needs. German industry is happy because it's being paid for to work. But Ukraine isn't getting much out of it in industrial terms. So the really interesting model, I think, is what's known now as the Danish model. What happens with the Danish model is that the Ukrainian side creates a list of projects that it wants to run, the equipment that it needs, and then suggests a number of Ukrainian companies that could actually carry out that work and build that equipment. Denmark then checks those companies and their capacities, and Denmark then pays for the orders. And this is interesting on a number of levels. Still, Ukraine gets the weapons it needs, but it's also boosting its industry, and that industry is much closer to the battlefield with Ukrainians involved. Because Denmark is involved, Ukraine also gets access to EU certification and EU markets, so it can export any surplus. One good example of this system was actually the Bogdan artillery system, which was manufactured through this funding method. In 2024, 590 million euro went through these channels. Denmark provided 170 million, and the European Union's European Peace Facility provided 390 million, with other countries providing the rest. This system has turned out to be very rapid, relatively cheap, and there are two other big benefits that are often overlooked when we talk about defence industry. The first is that the Ukrainians need far less training. So when we give American equipment or European equipment to Ukrainians, they have to go through long training exercises to learn how to use German tanks or British rocket launchers or whatever. That's not very efficient. But because Ukrainian companies are building this equipment, well, they know how it works. They speak Ukrainian already. They can bring in the soldiers at a very early stage. There's much less training involved. And that's efficient, that's quick, that's cheap. And then the other thing is that it is avoiding a brain drain of Ukrainian engineers out of Ukraine to work for Western military and defence contractors. And that's, of course, a big issue for Ukraine. So this way, Ukrainian companies get to hang on to their own talent because work is available, being paid for through this Danish method. So I hope I've managed to show you that quite apart from the horror of the Ukraine war as a war, there are some extremely important lessons that we in the West will have to keep in mind. Firstly, that military doctrines are changing and our militaries need to adapt to that. And secondly, that Perhaps the old industrial method needs to change in order to keep up with rapidly developing modern warfare. And then on top of that, perhaps the way that we help Ukraine needs to change as well, to this Danish method rather than just a sort of charitable aid sort of approach. There's a lot to get your teeth into there, but this is clearly the biggest war and the most technologically modern war of arguably the century. And it's very important that Western countries don't just write this off as not quite the way that we would do warfare, and that we learn the lessons for any potential threat to come. Because this is, it's not really about we want to fight in the same way that Ukraine has fought and is fighting, but rather what we can see in Ukraine is how a potential enemy would fight in modern war, and can we therefore react to that quickly. Obviously the West would have different resources to Ukraine available, but the lessons learned are still valid. So I do hope that military leaders are paying attention. Thank you.